Greetings and salutations, all you individuals. You better believe it is another epi of League Unlocked. My name is Eric Flan, Han Solo on today's epi for a week 2 installment for power rankings in the LEC and the LCK. Also doing a second round of some studs and duds from the week. You'll notice we're not talking LTA North just yet. Number one, I feel like the power rankings would be a little bit dull with how the first week matchups were. Only a single best of 3 to talk about, and pretty much all the favorites won. So there wouldn't be that much interesting changes or any changes really from what you saw. So we're focusing still on the LEC and the LCK, where we actually had some exciting movement, some standout players, some disappointments across the board, and definitely some serious shuffling when you are talking about those power rankings, especially over in Europe. But one of the few spots where there wasn't movement was near that bottom of the table. The sole winless squad in SK Gaming staying put in that number 10 spot, now joined near the bottom with Rogue, who, yes, they won their first game. Yes, they've lost 5 in a row since then, but they at least had some positive moments where they either had leads in games or they had an avenue, they had a path where you could see them get back into a game against some, I'm not going to say great teams, because really it was only the Vitality one that they had angles to get back into the game. Against both KC and Fnatic, they were pretty much completely gapped across the board on that one. Team Heretics stay put as that kind of bottom 3. I don't want to say disappointing, because there's so much young talent. There weren't huge expectations for this Team Heretics squad, but they definitely were also outmatched against some of the top tier squads. But they did get a win against BDS, which was a bit of a surprise. So they still are definitely the better of that bottom 3. Vitality nearly had a 3-0 week, almost took down G2. It was a messy one, to be sure, that matchup for them. But 2 other wins for them against, not unfortunately, but the reason we're not a little more hyped about them is it was against Rogue. It was against the bottom of the table, but they still come out on top. We have definitely seen the double-edged sword that is Hylissang, especially this week. First week, we gave him the dud of week 1 because it didn't seem like the team was on the same page, and he was making some vintage Hilly in all the wrong ways. That wine there was a hole in the cork, so it definitely went bad. It didn't capture the decades of flavor. It was bad. There were still some rough moments for him in this week, but for the most part, the rest of the team on the same page, and a definite improvement for Team Vitality. BDS comes crumbling out of that top 3. I still think this team is better than the 2-4 record, and obviously the Heretics loss is a painful one, to be sure, but their other losses were against some of the better teams in Movistar, Koi, and Fnatic. But the Heretics one is the painful loss and the real reason they're dropping down a bunch, but they're better than 2-4. They're maybe not as good as I thought. I thought on paper the roster moves they made in the offseason was going to be a pretty significant improvement, and that's an improvement on a team that was kind of consensus top 4 pretty much every single split in 2024. So looking for and expecting a little bit more out of BDS. Obviously, we're expecting more out of the 4-time defending champions, even with 2 roster changes coming in. G2 slowly beginning that climb back to the upper echelon of the LEC, and obviously without the Giant X win at the end of the week, you wouldn't be feeling so good after they got dismantled by Fnatic. Barely beat Vitality, but we got some peak G2 performance against a team who has looked elite through the first 5 games, not the 6th one, because G2 absolutely destroyed GX enough to have them plummeting out of that top spot. Still, the body of work through 6 games is enough to have Giant X ahead of G2 despite losing that head-to-head, but faith slowly being restored back into G2, and I don't think it's I don't think the hype is dying or it's a fluke or anything for GX, how good they looked in the first few weeks, or the first week and a half. Again, we've played a lot of games, but it's only been a week or two that we've actually been seeing the LEC. But G2, Skumond, and Labrov definitely had a bounce back. They were probably their best players in that Giant X matchup. It's still... They can only go so far as Caps. It feels like even more so with this roster, but again, it's only 6 games, so it's hardly any body of work to actually be judging what power level a team is at, especially a team like G2 who has so much leeway and grace for how good the 3 core returning members have been for 2+ years in Europe. Giant X we mentioned, Fnatic, 2 spots back up into the top 3. Obviously the G2 win helps. They had a slow start against BDS but bounced back in a big way. Upset has been fantastic. I know this is a guy who at times we've talked about as the best AD carry in Europe, but I think the expectations were a little lower coming into this year because he'd been away, because his last time on KC and some of the other rosters were not quite at the level that we're used to. And let's face it, he's been around for a long time, but he has absolutely been at peak levels. Humanoid did some great farming, had a lot of gold, got cut out a couple times on the Smolder in their final match of the weekend, but that's just the Humanoid way. Feeling pretty good about Fnatic so far. Feeling really good about the top 2 on this list. Movistar, Koi. That one bad game, just a blip in the radar. They had the big win against Giant X that we already kind of talked about. That was one of the highest quality matches still of the entire second week of action over in the LEC. And both against BDS and SK. Pretty convincing stomps. The SK one in particular was an absolute destruction on the Rift for them. And again, it was pretty convincing against BDS as well. The macro gameplay out of Movistar compared to what they got last year is leaps and bounds different. And Supa and Alvaro continue to carry that Worlds momentum despite it being like 6 months apart and look like one of the premier bot lanes in the LEC. Maybe not to the level of Kalist and Targamas, or at least Kalist at the very little. But K-Corp, man, 5 wins basically took them all of 2024 to get, and they're already sitting here at 5-1, and they are destroying people on the Rift. Yes, it was an easy schedule, about as easy as you get. Literally the 3 bottom teams on these rankings was their scheduled opponents, but listen, they got business done. They absolutely destroyed all 3 of these matchups. I can't wait to see the growth of this team and how they match up against the more premier teams in Europe and when we get to these best of 5s. But from a fan perspective and from an LEC perspective, K-Corp being at this level, 16 thumbs up in terms of viewership for the entire region. LCK side of things, it's rare that we have big movement, it feels like, in the LCK when we do these rankings, but pretty similar to the LEC. Only one team staying put from what we did in that first week of rankings. And even down at the bottom, we've got big movement, even with some of these winless teams. Both Nongshim and BNK FearX getting knocked down a little bit. And again, even though BNK remain the only winless team on either of these groups in the inaugural LCK Cup, I feel like they're better than that. I know we love to bring up the game that they lost to Gen G, that they absolutely had no business winning, but they have at the very least been competitive. Took a game off of D+. They're pretty much... They went to games, they've gone to game 3s at least in 3 out of their 4 series so far, and that's against, elite squads like D+ and Gen G in 2 of those. So I still don't think this is going to be the team that's going to be eliminated in this opening round of the LCK Cup. I mean, they're still dropping down to the 9 spot, but I still feel like they're better than Nongshim, and they might even be better than some of the other teams near this bottom. The Freaks are the disappointing one. DN Freaks, the rebrand has not been kind to them. And case in point, they are one of the main reasons why you see DRX with the big climb up there to within the top 5. DRX somehow sitting at 3-1, but they beat the Freaks. They beat FearX, BNK FearX. So DRX has been really The surprise so far of at least the bottom half of these LCK standings in tandem, the negative surprise has definitely been those DN Freaks and the level that they have been at. This usually it takes a little bit longer for the then Kwangdong Freaks for us to be disappointed. They're not living up to the hype. They're choking away that final playoff spot or just not playing at a level that you would hope for. You would think Bulldog's getting benched. Berserker seems, I'm not going to say he doesn't seem like he's on the same page, but seems like the synergy isn't quite there with the rest of this squad yet. There's lots of room for improvement. And again, this opening round of the LCK Cup, really it just matters who finishes 10th. There's plenty of opportunity for all the other 9 teams to bounce back in the next round. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's just you're basically playing a game of Russian roulette of not being that absolute bottom team in the losing group. And still right now, it very much looks like it's going to be on that Baron group side. So the Freaks are definitely in shaky waters. I know they're still ahead of FearX, but as I said, it feels like they're actually better than that 0-4 record. So I'd be sweating a little bit if I am those Freaks. The Bros get to climb up a little bit in the most spectacular fashion. They 2-0 Gen G, only to follow that up by dropping a game to KT Roaster 2-0 the other way. So that is just the ebbs and flows that you get from the OK Savings Bank Freddie Brion. They're better than 1-3. I know this is sounding like a broken record saying all these teams, well, they're actually better than the record says, but case in point, the Gen G game wasn't just Gen G having an off day. It was absolutely the Bros playing at that Kespa Cup level and a level that looks like they can contend with, I'm not going to say the top 4, but to be just outside of that top 4 bubble in the LCK, which is why we gave them a little bit of a climb. But because they could not beat KT, no way that they're usurping them. Even though KT has been underwhelming in their own right, it's kind of been the BDD show for the majority of the split. BDD and Cuz. We'll give Cuz that Robin to BDD's Batman status that we've seen so far, which truthfully is probably what most people expected coming into this year with this revamped budget KT lineup. There was going to be a lot of pressure on BDD and Cuz, and the two of them have delivered. Just need the rest of the roster to step up a little bit if they want to be legit contenders. Because again, the top 4, it doesn't really matter how much some of these top 4 teams struggle. They are still going to be the top 4 teams apart from a real disastrous stretch. It's more just a reshuffling of the placement for these squads, and a reshuffling there was across the board in that top 4 as Hanwha Life, the direct head-to-head between D Plus is, of course, having the biggest impact on this list as Hanwha drops down with a 2-2 record, and D Plus Kia sits pretty in that top spot at 4-0. And Mark and I have been doing a lot of glazing for this D Plus Kia squad, talking about the youth movement. Both Lucid and Siwoo have been, I don't want to say the surprises, but the standout performers so far. That combined with Beryl coming into this lineup, or coming back into this lineup, and kind of changing how the communication and how the macro game sense for the squad is, how to play with all these unbelievable amounts of neutral objectives, how to play around Octon, how to play around Dragon, the Grubs, the Herald. It's become so actually complicated. All you have to do is try and explain what's going on the map to someone who's new to the game, and you'll see how complicated it is. But D Plus are piloting it perfectly. Showmaker's in the best form he's been in a couple of years, and Aiming has really just kind of had to have a back seat and sit there. He still had the best KDA of week 2 because he didn't have to do much. He can just sit pretty because everyone else is doing the heavy lifting, which, as I've alluded to before, is the complete opposite of what we were getting from this squad last year. Still not concerned really about Hanwha Life. The 2-2 record looks worse than it actually is, especially when you know it's been to D Plus and Gen G, the 2 top teams on this list. So Hanwha's going to be just fine. T1, the only drama is actually, does Smash keep starting over Guma? That's There's no actual drama on the Rift. Yes, they've dropped the game, or they've dropped the series. They're sitting at 3-1. They looked much better this past week against, I know Nongshim and KT isn't the most difficult of schedules, but they looked good in it, and they're probably a comparable power level to Hanwha Life. Again, this entire top four, they're so even in terms of skills right now that D+, is kind of at the highest of highs that you would have expected them to start, but there's going to be so much fluctuation between this top four as this LCK Cup goes on because they are such similar power level. Any one of these four could be the representatives from the LCK at this new look first stand event that will be hosted in South Korea. So they will be the home squad, but any four of these would be a terrifying prospect for any of these other international regions to come over and match up against, especially when it's just one team from every region that's going to be representing. But I would be pretty shocked if at almost any time this year any of these four are not making up the top four in some order. I don't like DRX, KT, the Bros, the Freaks. I'm hard pressed to see any of them cracking the top four based on the very, very early signs that we have seen so far in 2025. Time now for our second installment of a little bit of studs and duds. These are the standout performers for the good and bad that we got in week 2. Again, sticking it to just the LEC and the LCK this week, but might eventually implement more LTA action, maybe some LPL action depending on how big the standouts are. Let's start with the good. We'll start with the good side of things, and you go to the LEC for the stud. The numbers don't do it justice. The insane hype that was surrounded around Kalist basically since this dude has been 16, and then the entire time he was on KC Blue, and now that he's in the LEC, it's only gotten higher, and somehow my dude is not only matching these ludicrous expectations, but exceeding them. If you just have the pro view, or just watch from his point of view this week, you will see the insane confidence that this guy plays at. I saw someone compare it to, he plays more like a Korean AD carry, not an EU AD carry, and that's because he knows what his boundaries are. He knows how far forward he can play without getting caught while putting so much pressure on the opposing team. Even just an auto attack here, stepping forward without anyone able to do anything. But we've seen it on multiple picks now. The Ezreal, the Draven outplays where he's calculating how much mana the opposing Kalista has. I think it was Patrick in that Rogue matchup. He knows he doesn't have enough to do range, so he holds on to his flash. And to hear him explain it to Yike in one of these behind the scenes videos, this guy is just operating 3 steps ahead of any opposition. And yes, the confidence is absolutely there for him. This guy is a future star in the making, and I think the development is already ahead of schedule. He's already looking like one of the best, most exciting, not just AD carries, but players in the entire LEC. So big shout out to Kalist, absolutely deserving of the stud of the week in the LEC. The stud on the LCK side of things, because we're keeping it with the good vibes to start. Another jungler, we highlighted Lucid in week 1. I almost wanted to give it to him again, but we had to give it out to the standout on T1. And no, it's not Smash. It is Owner this week. He picked up Series MVP against Nongshim. He was great in their series against KT in both of their wins. And no player on T1 has been more linked to when he plays well, the team looks infinitely better. When they have their Worlds runs, we get Worlds Owner. When he's playing at a high level, T1 looks like the best team or one of the best teams in the world. When Owner is struggling, that's when all the drama is surrounding it. Well, on the Lilia, the Skarner, the Xin Zhao this week, he was absolutely impeccable in the early game, impeccable at engaging, and impeccable, to say the same word 3 times, at carrying some of these team fights, especially that Lilia game where he was like 10-1 at one point. So Owner looking fantastic, deserving of that honor for this week in week 2. Unfortunately, we got to look at some of the duds. Again, both the LCK and the LEC over in South Korea. Even though they got a win, they went 1-1. KT Roaster, we've got to look at Doctor. And you could honestly throw the bot lane together because Wei had some rough moments as well. They were getting gapped in laning phase more often than not. Often it was Wei who was the one suffering the actual death, but the 2v2 as a whole was a disaster, especially when you have a rookie coming in. Smash makes his debuts, immediately getting first blood, immediately getting solo. We're straight up 2v2 kills alongside Kyria. I know that's still a pretty lethal bot lane, but Doc Dom, especially when you're seeing Hype play on the bros and playing at a pretty high level, you're really just scratching your head going, why did you not keep Hype and Wade together? Doc Dom, I know he had a bit of a resurgent year on FPX, but this was still one of the biggest head scratchers of the offseason. He had a rough week for KT again, despite them picking up a series win. He's looking like in a role that's so unbelievably stacked in the LCK. The KT bot lane is definitely looking like a liability early on in 2025. The LEC dud, we're given the honors. It's shared 5 ways. We're giving it to a full team, and that is SK Gaming. Another 0-3 week. The only winless team in the LEC. The only team in week 2 to not get a single Baron or Atakan. They actually got some first turrets, but it did not amount to much. And they definitely get the award for most times the broadcast was confused with the play that SK was making. They got completely smashed in some of these matchups. They definitely do not look like a cohesive unit. I don't see many positive signs as to how they can turn things around here. Unfortunately, Reeker coming back as the mid laner. He's a guy we've seen in the LEC before, and he lost his starting spot on what was then Mad Lions, and it feels like he's a bit outmatched here early on in the LEC, and there's not too much to be positive about for SK, but at least they go down as a team. They get to share the dud honors as a unit, and unfortunately, Loopy was a guy we mentioned maybe even in week 1 alongside Hillisang, but here he is in week 2 alongside the rest of the SK boys. Be careful that we need to step it up, though, because we don't want to be talking about you guys as the duds for a second straight week. But SK, rough to watch some of their games so far. But that is it today for League Unlocked. My name is Eric. Thank you to all you gorgeous individuals for hanging out as always. And we will catch you on that flippity flip.